question.
I'm going to move on the topic. Free Congressman. My name is Lori Williams, and I'm a resident of Fair Oaks, California, and I'm also a proud employee of Sprint. And I've come here tonight to just
I can't hear.
heard on a different topic.
I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't hear.
But one close to my heart, and it's my job. And if the current T-Mobile takeover of AT&T does go through, then we are at risk of having a duopoly in this country where two telecommunications companies will control 80% of the market. The only other comparisons I can make are two top oil companies only control 18%. In the auto industry, the two top manufacturers control 37%. In the banking industry, our two top banks control 27%. Not only am I an employee of Sprint, I just have to say that I'm also a single mother and I work 2 jobs. I'm concerned not only for my job, but for the job of hundreds of your constituents. If this takeover does go through, $39 billion will be paid to Deutschland and $25 billion of it in cash. So I urge you to ask and appeal to the FCC and the DOJ and let them know that this takeover will affect American jobs at a time when we're trying to create new jobs. We need to keep the ones we've got.
That's right. Additionally,
it will also affect competition, the consumers, our economy at large. Thank you very much.
We have a mechanism in our country where both the FCC and the Department of Justice are required to look at that. The DOJ specifically from a question of antitrust, which goes to the question of competitiveness. They do take into consideration the existence of duopoly, if that were in fact the case. They have certain standards that are both the product of legislation passed by the Congress and by laws as determined by the courts over the years. When I was Attorney General, we had jurisdiction in the state of California for antitrust. In some cases, we had concurrent jurisdiction. That is, we had jurisdiction over the same sorts of merger requests as the federal government, and we used our standards. So I will watch that. I'm on the Judiciary Committee. We will look at what DOJ does on that. At this point in time, I think it's appropriate for them to try and make their determination based on what the law is, and we can have a chance to take a look at that. And then see if it does do the things that you're talking about. But the system is set up such that there are actual formulas that have been established over the years to figure out whether or not there is anti-competitive behavior as a result of those. And sometimes when they approve a merger, they will approve it with conditions. That is, the merged entity has to divest themselves of certain portions of it, sometimes spinning off other companies as a result. So we've not seen what the DOJ is going to do on this yet, but our committee would have jurisdiction over it. And I'm not on the subcommittee dealing with antitrust, but it eventually comes up to the full committee, so we'll have a chance to take a serious look at it. Yes. I don't know. You're deciding on it.
So it is being looked at, though?
Yeah. It is by both FCC.
Mr. Lungren, I'm hearing a lot of concern in our society, and I have several concerns that I'd just like you to continue to support. I'm 35 years old. I'm active 2030 here in Sacramento, Carmichael resident my entire life. I'd like you to continue to support athletics in our schools so that our children can be fit and active. And I'd also like for you to continue to support arts and music in our schools. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I happen to support those things, but those decisions are made at the local level by the local school district, which I think is appropriate. Sometimes we can give some spotlight on it. That's what I do with our Congressional Art Competition, to try and show it's important for all the schools and to have the competition, and then showcase these young people as we can, and encourage the schools to participate. One of the things that bothers me from time to time is not all the schools participate. So if you know of any schools that are out there that have students that have an artistic bent that would want to be involved, make sure they are in touch with our office, because that actually is something that's extremely important. I happen to think athletics are good. I think you learn a lot of things on the fields of competition. I also think it's good to be in a team sport rather than individual sport, but that's my bias. And I find that members of Congress who happen to be involved in a team sport, as opposed to individual sports when they were younger, seem to know how to try and work to get things done, as opposed to just stopping things from getting done. Find somebody else out there, Bob.
Hi. Hello, Congressman. My name is Jacob Stolzing. I'm a Boy Scout and I'm also a writer for my school newspaper.
Yes, sir.
And I'd like to ask you a question that's caused me great concern as I've watched this happen over and over again throughout my time in high school. And that's that year after year, I've seen talented, inspiring teachers who are untenured receive pink slips and some of them get laid off. And I've also watched as teachers that just have no passion for their job, that don't properly educate their students, have absolutely no concern about losing their job because of their tenure status. So my question to you is, also in light of what's happened in Wisconsin, is do you feel it's right to create a merit pit in our schools, or do you feel that it's right to continue the tenure system and protect teachers, some of which who are not the best qualified to do their job?
Well, let me answer it this way. Number one, I think it's important that those decisions be made on the state and local level, not the federal government deciding that. I think one of the biggest mistakes we made, and it was just before I went to Congress in 2005, was to pass an initiative that President Bush came up with and was supported on a bipartisan basis in the Congress, called basically No Child Left Behind. The reason is I think it gives far too much power to the federal government, and I think frankly it interferes with teachers' ability to sometimes do the best job for their students. I happen to think you ought to have a okay, we got some Panama going on. I do think that schools ought to have an opportunity to have some standardized testing so that you get an idea of how you are doing versus other students in the country and the world, for that matter. But I think it's been overdone with No Child Left Behind. On the question of tenure and merit pay, again, I think that ought to be decided on the local level. My thought is that we ought to keep the students most in mind, and we ought to do what's best for them. And I always thought a good teacher is better than a mediocre teacher, and a system that protects a mediocre teacher and penalizes a good teacher is not a good system. But again, that's how you work that out ought to be done at the local level, because I think we have made a mess of things when we've tried to direct it from the federal level. Okay, Bob, come on up here. Someone wants, no, Bob, come here now. We have somebody going through pantomime. He wants to. He works so hard, I'd hate to see him. Yes.
Hello, my name is Charles Williams, and I'm a Folsom resident, and I also am a business owner of a manufacturing company. And you stated that you're working to, I quote, create jobs and economic growth by lowering taxes, improving incentives for job creators to work, invest, and innovate in the U.S. Most people in business realize that this is putting the horse before the cart. The solution you're proposing only works when people have money to spend and there is high demand for products and services. In this economy, there is a lack of demand for products and services. Even if taxes were 0% and there were no regulations, it still makes no good business sense to hire new employees here in the U.S. In fact, The only thing we have done, as a Republican as I am, is to cut government spending, which destroyed the demand for business products and services here in the U.S. Business only hires new employees to serve the demand for products and services. Demand can only be increased by people having money to spend on these goods and services. One way I think is to increase demand for it can be accomplished by making needed infrastructure repairs to our crumbling roads, bridges, schools. What I want to know from you is how do you plan on increasing demand for goods and services here in the U.S. so businessmen like myself will have the incentive to hire new workers to meet that new demand?
I mean, there's two general approaches to try and quote-unquote stimulate the economy. One is the idea that you rely primarily on government spending that somehow will increase demand and therefore stimulate the economy. The other is that you try and work on economic fundamentals that will make it more likely that people in the private sector will risk capital such that they will actually create more goods and services and have an opportunity for more jobs. We have tried the stimulus approach. It didn't work.
No, you haven't.
Japan tried the stimulus approach. It was either 7 or 11 times. And most economists would say that created what has been known as the lost decade and now known as the lost 2 decades in Japan. We have a different system, I believe, which is based on having the most dynamic, most creative, most responsive economy in the world. And in the last number of years, instead of trying to work to unleash that, we have worked in ways that suggested that the government, particularly the federal government, is the way that you can do it. Now, the fact of the matter is, government doesn't create wealth. The private sector creates wealth. That's not to say we don't need government. We do need government. But government is not the producer of wealth. Never has been, never has worked in terms of anything I'm aware of. In terms of infrastructure, one of the reasons I voted against the president's stimulus package is because it did not front-load infrastructure. Most of the money, I think 16% of the stimulus package went to infrastructure. And most of that hadn't been built. The president joked about it 2 weeks ago when he said, well, I guess shovel-ready wasn't really shovel-ready. At the time they were coming up with the plan, I suggested that it be heavily weighted towards infrastructure. It be front-loaded, and in order to have those infrastructure projects go through, we had to also expedite the environmental review. Because in project after project, the reason why they haven't gone forward is lawsuits of environmental nature. And if they were serious about wanting to stimulate the economy through infrastructure, they would have bitten the bullet and they would have said, all right, for this period of time, we will expedite environmental review. They refused to do that, which suggests to me they weren't as serious about creating infrastructure as they had said.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Congressman, I really appreciate the fact that you started off by talking about the dam situation here in California and the potential for a terrorist attack on Folsom.
That's the three-letter dam.
Three-letter dam, absolutely. But the point I wanted to make is a much more realistic problem, a much greater realistic threat to us here, right now, is not Al-Qaeda blowing up that dam, but just like what happened, I think it was 14 years ago, because of poor maintenance, one of the gates just blew right off. And it's not the only dam in California that's in this circumstance. There's 69 of California's dams that are in need of rehabilitation to meet basic state-level standards. 30% of California's bridges are structurally deficient. Now, I understand that you question whether or not increased spending for stimulus is going to get the economy back. My question and my point is not directed towards that at all. But our infrastructure is crumbling, sir. The I-80 between Watt Avenue and I-5 is a disgrace. It's just, I get beat up just driving out in the slow lane. I just don't understand why I have to drive on this beat up, messed up road. You can address that, sir?
Well, as I said before, I happen to believe that we ought to have front-loaded infrastructure projects that were true infrastructure. And to the extent that environmental review was required, and it isn't all of them, we should have expedited it, number one. Number two, if you're talking about the needs at Folsom Dam, I've been the strongest advocate of that, and have made sure that we had the funding for both the repairs at the dam, the creation of the spillway, which is actually the largest single project, I think, in the nation for the Bureau of Reclamation, including the gates on it, which actually amounts to a new dam. The bridge there, which I felt there was a responsibility for the federal government to participate in, and on the levy program. So I worked very, very hard for those particular things that are within my jurisdiction. In terms of our highways, I have to believe that we have in some ways taken money out of the Highway Trust Fund that should have been used for specific highway projects and done it for every other thing. And we have a serious problem that we're going to have to deal with, and that is this, and I was just speaking with some of the people involved in the industry this week. We have the gasoline tax, which is a tax that is a per gallon tax. And as our cars are more energy efficient, we have a situation in which you're using less gasoline to travel more miles. So if you have a tax based on per gallon usage, it doesn't reflect the additional usage of the roads. So how do you work that? What would be the fair thing to do? Probably some sort of construct of a user fee, but how you create that is a tough thing. Some people say, well, you put some sort of device on a car, and then the government can read it, and it talks about invading privacy. Question is, do you do an odometer check over some period of time? Do you assume that people travel a certain amount of miles and they show that they travel less or they travel more? I mean, those are the kinds of things that I think we have to debate in Washington, D.C. We aren't there yet. But I do know this. We can't continue the way it is going on right now. When I was a kid growing up in California, we were so proud of the California highway and freeway system. They're the best in the world. Now, I can give you other ones too. Well, anyway, yeah, I-5 is pretty bad, but there's some other places that are pretty bad as well. So I have to agree that we ought to get back to priorities. And if the Highway Trust Fund is supposed to be used for highways, let's have it used for highways. But we've had it used for a number of different things, all with good intentions, but it's the sort of thing that happens when we tend to get away from the specific or essential purpose of something and kind of split off to other things. We lose sight of what it was originally set up for. So you're absolutely right. That's one of the things I hope as we get through this review of spending on the federal level, we start saying what's essential, what's not essential, what's more important, what's less important, where's the federal responsibility versus the state responsibility versus the local responsibility. And until we have that conversation, I think questions like yours are going to continue to be asked because we will not resolve it. But I think anybody looking at it objectively would have to say that our infrastructure is in serious need of repair. You're absolutely right.
Your buddy could say,
Yes.
hey, let's put a job bill all about infrastructure. And then you get in there and do it for California, please.
Mr. Congressman, thank you very much for this town hall meeting. There's not many nations that enjoy this.
Well, there are. Whoa.
Now, if you broke it, you have to pay for it.
All right.
54 years registered to vote. All Republican. so I had to wait till I was 21. I'm not here for myself. I've got 3 grandkids. And every time Congress jacks up the debt limit, you're putting the burden not on me. Pity, I'll be long gone. But they won't be. I don't want my grandchildren paying for my repaired dam or highway. I don't want them paying for a state or federal employee who ought to be making something instead of using up taxpayer money. I implore you, on behalf of the people here who live within their means every month, to make the federal government do the same thing. Thank you.
I appreciate your sentiment. I've got 6 grandchildren. I'm very concerned about them and their future. I would say this, it is not the act of increasing the debt ceiling that's the problem. It's going into debt in the first place that's the problem. It's spending beyond our means. And that's why when I hear some people say, well, the total answer is a balanced budget constitution amendment, I say, wait a second. Man, it'll take years for that to get done. I mean, I think it's important to be out there. But we got to start doing it now. We got to make some sense of what it is that we are doing. I mean, I've told certain elected officials in this area at times when they have thought about coming back to Washington, D.C., or when they're back in Washington, D.C., asking if they can get federal funds for a particular program or project. I said, where's the federal nexus? There ought to be a federal relationship, because otherwise it might be like me, seeing that we need to spend more money on defense and we're not doing it, coming to the Board of Supervisors in Sacramento and saying, by the way, we need more money for national defense, so we want 10% of the Sacramento County budget. People would say, get out of here, it's not our job. Well, what's happened in the past is there's been too much of the idea that, well, these